Hi everyone, a very good evening to each one of you. So this is 𝗗𝗃 Malhotra, Operations Manager at the team MOS. So I welcome you all in our today's webinar on the topic how to conduct a data protection impact assessment, DPIA. So we have with us 𝗗𝗃 HS who will be leading this webinar with us. So I'll just give a small context of what we are going to do in today's session. So this session is designed to give you a practical insights about how organizations can identify, assess, and manage privacy risk while processing the personal data. So in this session, Krishna will be helping us walking through about DPIA, how it get conducted, how organizations can identify and mitigate privacy risk. So Krishna is a founder of 𝗖𝗇𝗃, and 𝗖𝗇𝗃 is a next generation technology solution organization that is built on the belief that the solution should be AI first, yet people first. So over a year, Krishna has worked in various industries like healthcare, fintech, e-commerce, and information security too. So Krishna has expertise and he has various certifications like CIPPE, ISO 27001, ISO 27701, and he also know about various privacy frameworks like GDPR, DPDPA, and much more. So let's get started with the session now. So we are excited to learn from his experience today. So over to you, Krishna. We can just start it now.
Sure. Thank you, 𝗗𝗃. Thank you for setting up that context. Do you want me to wait for a few more minutes? Because I still see a lot of participants coming in. If possible, we can probably start in 3 minutes, or I'm good to start either way.
Yeah, anything works. We can wait for next 3 minutes and then you can start off with it.
Sure. So folks, please bear with us for maybe 3 more minutes, and we're just waiting for a few more people to join in. As and when they join in, we'll just start with the session. Yeah. And in the meantime, what I will do is I'll present my screen. And thank you, 𝗗𝗃, for setting up the context and the introductions. As 𝗗𝗃 mentioned, my name is Krishna, and I'm responsible for a lot of implementation and execution of global data protection programs for my customers. And of course, we also see a lot of nuances that are very, very different when it comes to each of these data protection law. But one thing that remains fundamental is how data flows and what are the systems or what are the people that it interacts with. So with that notion in mind, I'll be just waiting for a few more minutes before we get into the depth of a few things. And then I will walk you through what a DPI looks like and how to conduct a session around it. So just bear with us for 2 more minutes and we'll start with the session very soon. Thank you so much. Awesome. So 𝗗𝗃, I would be starting now. So first of all, welcome everyone to this workshop where we would focus on how to conduct a DPIA or a data protection impact assessment. We've built this workshop keeping in mind that DPIA may mean a different thing to a lot of different people across the globe, considering that there are certain nuances that we must keep in mind when we look at DPIA for each jurisdiction. For example, if you're looking at that from a European angle, if you're looking at from an India perspective, or maybe the Middle East or North Africa region, you would notice that DPIA may not exist in the same form or methodology across regions, which is why we will just give you a walkthrough of the evolution of it. So you can see on my screen that we have an interactive workshop that we have created specifically for this. So this file will walk you through the journey of when a DPIA started, what is the history behind it, where are we today, and we'll start with setting the context so that we can also understand the depth and the requirement of why PIAs or DPIAs came into the picture. Now, when you look at the evolution side of things, you would notice that mainly DPIA is something that exists across jurisdictions, but some people may call it a PIA, some people may call it a PRA, some people may call it a DPRA, and all of those mean different things, right? All of those mean different things in different contexts, and privacy is very contextual. It's not easy because it's so contextual that there is no yes or no clear answer to most questions. But at the same time, there are so many guidelines out there by supervisory authorities, data protection authorities that help you understand how to solve a particular problem statement that arrived at your desk. And if you are a privacy professional, you would probably also have noticed that it's not very easy to explain business stakeholders or individuals from different departments as to what the requirements are. So you can't just go and quote the law. You have to present it to them in a practical way where they are also able to understand their responsibilities around the DPIA. At the same time, I also want to probably talk a bit about who should do a DPIA, right? Ideally, it should not be a DPO. It should be the team that processes personal data or the department that processes personal data that should evaluate risks. The DPIA's output is something that should be reviewed and consulted by a DPO. But in most cases in India or in other countries, what we notice is that companies, because of a lack of bandwidth or because of a lack of privacy professionals available who know how to conduct a DPIA, it's typically the DPO that does the DPIA and also gets it signed off from different departments. There is a conflict when we do that, but at the same time, it is also something that can be looked at as a market reality today. Now, the evolution of DPDPA, right? We noticed that DPDPA started emerging, or PIA started emerging in New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and Australian law came up in 1988, when it was one of the first countries to talk about PIAs, privacy risk assessments, privacy impact assessments. And in 2002, we had the EU directives. The DPA's, data protection authorities, began recommending prior checking before processing personal data. Now, DPIA is something that you need to do before you conduct or enable a processing activity. But in today's world, we typically notice that most countries or most departments process personal data and DPIA is conducted after the processing is already done. They do it because it's more of a compliance exercise, but at the same time, it goes against the very concept and principle of a DPIA, which should be done when the processing activity is not initiated, so that an individual or a company can understand that these are the privacy risks that may be there to the rights of data principals or data subjects. So a DPIA ideally should be done before the processing activity is started, but we notice that it's typically done post facto or after the processing activity has been initiated. So we noticed that PIAs emerged in New Zealand, Canada, and I'll just change this to visual mode so that we can have some more visual elements and make it more concise so that I can do the talking and you can relate to the story that I'm trying to build with the entire workshop. Now, when you look at the evolution of the DPIA, you would notice that pre-GDPR era PIAs emerged, then EU introduced prior checking, then the CNIL or the French Supervisory Authority formalizes PIA. And one of the great things that CNIL or the French Supervisory Authority did is that they also open sourced the PIA tool. Now, the interesting part there is that when you open source a PIA tool or a web platform that people can look at, it really helps organizations process personal data more responsibly, and they also get clarity as to what exactly needs to be done. Then, of course, the GDPR came in. Article 35 talks a lot about how DPIA should be triggered, in what cases do you need to do a DPIA, and so on. So Article 35 in the GDPR talks a lot about DPIA, the kind of triggers that enable you to conduct a DPIA, and specifically determine when that needs to be done. In the GDPR era, we noted that ISO 29134 was another international standard that was published. And once the GDPR was enforced, there was also the European Data Protection Board 9 criteria. And UK also came up with their own related pieces around what could be mandatory versus what is not mandatory. So these are the things that we noticed when we look at the evolution of the DPIA, where it came from, what was the context around it, and so on. right? And we also notice a lot of global expansion now that India also came up with its own version of data protection law in 2023. And we also noticed that there are different timelines. There's an 18-month compliance window in terms of when can companies start their compliance journey, because to bring a concept such as data privacy to a country where contextually privacy may mean different to a lot of people is not really easy, because you have to educate, you have to make people aware what data privacy means. And typically what we do, the first thing we do is we start with differentiating between personal data and personally identifiable information. Now, the law, of course, may have certain legal text that defines what personal data is, but when you are a global organization and you have to deal with multiple other data protection laws in different jurisdictions, it becomes really, really difficult to keep a track of it. So we'll talk about how a DPI needs to be done. We already spoke a bit about the evolution. Now we'll go into depth of how you can also conduct DPIAs, what are the different triggers for DPIAs, and so on. You would also notice that today there are close to 130 countries or more than 130 countries that require some form of a data protection impact assessment. There are different triggers in different jurisdictions. There are different reasons when a DPI needs to be done. But at the same time, there are a lot of countries in the world that have some sort of a data protection law. And all of these laws have this commonality of conducting a risk assessment or conducting an assessment that helps people understand what are the risks to the rights of data subjects. Now, I just want to emphasize on this point, right? The risks to the rights of the data subject. Contrary to all the information security assessments that you would do, because information security is supposed to support the organization's business objectives, data privacy from a regulatory landscape or a regulatory angle is generally meant to protect the rights of data subjects. What are some of those rights? We'll get into that as well, but this is the context that I want to set before we get into depth of a few things around data protection impact assessment. Now, why does the DPI matter? Why do we have to do it? Of course, it's a regulatory requirement. It's a legal mandate to do it in certain cases. But why else do we need to do it? And how do you even convince an organization to change their thought on how personal data they process, change their thought on the additional obligations they have to meet if they qualify as a data controller versus a data processor or a data fiduciary in Indian terms? So these are the different things that we look at. Now, why does a DPI matter? Financial loss is one of the biggest reasons that we have noticed that fraud, drained accounts, regulatory penalties, of course, impact a lot of people. Identity theft is very common. Whenever there is a data breach that happens when person there is identity theft that we notice. Just give me a second. There's some background noise. I'll just yeah. Would request the new joiners to also potentially mute your audio so that the other attendees are not disturbed. Thank you so much. Perfect. So I was talking about why DPI matters, apart from it being a regulatory requirement. Why else do we do it? Because in most cases, companies may not realize that because of their processing that they do on personal data, there could be rights that are violated of a data subject. In most countries, automated decision making, user profiling, children's personal data processing has to be done in a particular way. And if you don't do how it's supposed to, it may invite fines, it may invite legal non-compliance, it may also invite cancellation of contracts with businesses if you're a business a B2B service provider. So those are certain things that may happen on why you need to do a DPIA, apart from it being a regulatory requirement. We've noticed that a lot of breaches actually affects organization a lot. It's not just about losing some money, or it's not just about eroding customer trust, but it's also about reputational harm that happens. And by a lot of surveys and researches we have done, and a lot of researches that have happened, we have also noticed that 60% of consumers lose trust post data breach. Now, there is no company in the world that may guarantee that you or your organization may not go through a data breach. It is possible. And especially with AI coming into picture, with autonomous attacks becoming a thing these days, we've also noticed that a lot of attacks in 2025 were actually AI driven or AI powered. So AI adoption may still take some more time, but AI cybersecurity attacks, they have started. And when something like that starts, when a new technology is introduced or an innovative technology is introduced, It has the potential to change the world, but it also has the potential to cause catastrophe. So that is where we need to be very, very careful on looking at how we process personal data of individuals. Now, when we say personal data, we don't only look at personal data of customers in a B2C setup or a business to customer setup. We also look at personal data of employees. We also look at personal data of vendors. We look at personal data of individuals who are also applying for a job or a role at your organization. So as an organization, your responsibility is to make sure that all of these data subjects or data principles, they are given the right kind of protection, or they are able to invoke their rights that are given to them by the law. As an organization, if you don't enable these processes, you will invite regulatory fines, but at the same time, there will be customer trust that is eroded. Now, some companies come to us and say that, Krishna, we are a B2B company, we don't process any personal data, because they think that personal data of customers are the only thing that matter, but that's untrue. Personal data of any individual, any natural living person is something that typically comes under the purview of most data protection laws across the world. Now, some people also say that the law is fairly straightforward to read, it's fairly easy to understand, but because it's a regulatory requirement, there are so many nuances around it. And if you are a global data protection officer, it becomes really difficult to keep a track of all of it. So how do you keep a track? You make sure that you have the right kind of regulatory updates from different supervisory authorities that your company operates in, and you're able to make changes to your notices, policies, potentially your DPIA as well, as and when those notifications come. I'll just take a quick pause, let all of you seep in the information that we just discussed about. Probably just take a minute to also look at the screen, and I'll walk you through the next piece around what are the kind of processes that may require a DPIA, what are the triggers around it as well. So I've also done a quick comparison of GDPR versus the DPDPA. Now, there are differences, right? So you can't just say that I have a DPIA template that meets all global data protection laws. There may be a few pieces that may be different. There may be a few pieces that will differ across every single law. So we did a simple comparison between GDPR and DPDPA. So DPDPA is the India's Digital Personal Data Protection Act that focuses on protecting digital personal data. Now, the first difference between GDPR and DPDPA is the scope of personal data that it applies to. GDPR applies on physical as well as digital personal data. The Indian DPDPA only applies on digital personal data or physical data that has been digitized subsequently. So that is one of the core differences between GDPR and DPDPA. But at the same time, a lot of other things also differ. Who must do a DPIA? In the GDPR, it is a controller with a high-risk processing activity. So there are certain triggers on what is a high-risk processing activity that enables conducting a DPIA for a controller or a data controller in the EU GDPR. In India, only significant data fiduciaries designated by the central government have to do a DPIA. Now, what is the difference? In EU GDPR, if you are a controller, and there are, of course, also definitions on what is a controller and what is a fiduciary. So a controller is an entity that determines the means and purpose of processing personal data. So if this controller does any high-risk processing, as per Article 35 definitions, it has to do a DPIA. The good thing about EU GDPR is that all nation states in EU, or at least most nation states in EU, have a template available on how to conduct a DPIA. So the supervisory authority or the regulatory authority in GDPR or EU are very active in helping people actually enable data privacy. In India, because the law is fairly new, it's fairly in a nascent stage of its evolution, we still have to understand who would be a significant data fiduciary. Although we know that there are certain class of data fiduciaries that may be signified or that may be designated as an SDF, but the quantification of it is still something that we are waiting for the central government to notify. Now, the trigger. In the EU region, there are 3 mandatory triggers plus 9 EDPB criteria, and plus for certain other areas that also requires a DPA. But the Data Protection Authority also have certain blacklists. So you can't just go and process personal data and use it for any purpose that you deem fit. You have to make sure that if you're doing it in a country like Spain, France, or maybe in a country like Germany, you also look at the local regulations that sit on top of GDPR. When you couple those, that is when you understand what are the compliance obligations of your organization. For India's DPDPA, it's mandatory for all SDFs. The frequency, traditionally, before processing, reassess when risk changes. There is no fixed schedule. Schedule is something that you determine. Most companies determine it as annually. Some companies determine it as whenever there is a material change on how the processing activity differs. In India, there's every 12 months from the SDF notification. So again, take a quick minute, go through the content on the screen as well, because it's very important to understand how the difference is there. Because if you look at a DPO role in EU, you would notice that there must be DPO advice that must be asked for when DPIA is conducted. But at the same time, in India, if you are a significant data fiduciary, that is when you must appoint an India-based DPO. In EU GDPR, you have an EU representative that has to be physically present there, but they may not also have to be a DPO as well. So you can outsource your DPO to potentially people from any regions, but you need to have an EU representative as well. In India, you must appoint an India-based DPO. So those are the differences that you notice also in the individual who governs data privacy or is responsible for managing regulatory data privacy. Some companies may also have different roles, such as a chief privacy officer or a data governance officer, or more recently, we've heard this term called data officer. So that's common. That's common when you are looking at it from a global landscape. And one very important thing you also have to understand is the context of processing and the culture of a country. Now, by default, the culture will be very different in a country like India versus a nation like Germany or France, because even in our discussions that we do at Dutin today with our customers, we notice that some people are very, very careful about it. Some people are very, very considerate about it. But there are organizations that don't really bother much because of the traditional regulatory landscape that they have noticed in India. So most companies are also willing to take a risk, willing to be non-compliant to certain things as well. So that's basically the difference in culture that we notice. But when we work in EU, we notice that everyone is very, very serious about data privacy. When we work in Middle East, we also see a similar stand that in Saudi Arabia, things may be moving really fast. But in the UAE, we notice that because there is no regulator for the PDPL in UAE, so there might be some companies that may not be very active in doing their data privacy compliance pieces. So you will see a lot of these differences. You will notice that companies behave differently for data privacy across the globe. Now, let's take a quick look at the different terminologies. Some people may say DPIA, PIA, PRA, and they use it interchangeably, which is not right, because there is a regulatory mandate to conduct a DPIA. Now, a data protection impact assessment, of course, is a regulatory requirement under Article 35 of the GDPR, and under DPDPA, if your organization is classified as a significant data fiduciary, then they need to do or need to conduct a DPIA. But there are global organizations that also conduct a privacy impact assessment. So what is the difference between a DPIA and a PIA? In GDPR, a DPIA is done when a processing activity triggers one of those criteria of high risk processing. In India, a DPIA is done when you are a significant data fiduciary as designated or notified by the central government. But a PIA has broader scope. It assesses all types of privacy implications, not just high risk processing activity. So any process or any processing activity that involves personal data, you can do PIA as a good to have, but a DPIA is a must have. So in simpler terms, DPIA is mandatory, must have, legally mandated. A PIA is done as a good to have exercise, or as an exercise that a company wants to do because it cares about customers' data privacy, individuals' data privacy, or employees' data privacy. So when we look at global organizations that are spread across countries, they usually conduct a PIA and a DPIA. But when we look at organizations that are smaller or maybe catering to a specific jurisdiction, they only conduct what is legally required, which is a DPIA. Now, in certain cases, companies may also do a PRA or a privacy risk assessment. Now, this is a very simple questionnaire or very simple assessment that determines whether a full DPIA needs to be conducted. So you can look at PRA as a simple, smaller version or a lightweight version of a DPIA, because a PRA may not get into the depth of data processing, but it will definitely understand whether a full-scale DPIA needs to be done. We will also walk you through a simple example of an individual who is shopping on an e-commerce platform, an online e-commerce platform. We will talk you through how they purchase a product and what are the data streams or data flows that you must consider when they are shopping. Now, the depth of it could be a lot because there are so many things that happen when you purchase a product. You go to the e-commerce website, you choose a product, there are cursor movements that happen, there are cookies that are placed on your browser, there's tracking that happens. So we'll get into the depth of that in a while, where we will show you a live demonstration of how we can do a DPIA for a company like that. So we'll also walk you through that so that you can understand better that this is how a DPIA needs to be done. And don't worry about taking screenshots of whatever is shown on the screen. We are happy to make it available. We are happy to just share it with you for after this session. So don't worry about taking screenshots. I really want all of you to focus on the content and the examples that we are discussing, because it's something that we'll make available to you in all cases as well. So I'll just take a quick pause here, probably just take some time for all of you to take in this information. DPIA, PIA, PRA, PPRA, these are the different pieces that we typically see, right? And at the same time, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to use the chat section and ask these questions. So I'll just take up a couple of questions that I see on the chat as well. Oh yeah, so there is a question about us sharing the slides. We will do that, don't worry at all. Who is considered as data controller in an organization? So Deepika, data controller in an organization is not a concept that you should be worried about. Data controller is something that a legal entity is, right? Or a data fiduciary is something that an organization is. So the organization or legal entity that determines the means and purpose of processing personal data. So I'll give you a quick example. Assume that you are an organization that is an e-commerce platform that sells maybe boots online or shoes online. Now, in this case, when I'm a website visitor or I just browse your website and you process my personal data, or you collect certain personal data attributes about me, you are the data controller, because you are determining the means of collection, which could be analytical platforms or certain cookies that you are placing. And at the same time, the kind of purpose that you are also determining is probably to look at my preferences or how I interact with your platform and so on. So the means and purpose is something that the data controller is looking at. So in those cases, the organization will be a data controller. But if you are a B2B technical service provider, if you are a company that processes data on behalf of your customer, then you would be a data processor. So for example, if you are a large IT services vendor and you are providing services to a e-commerce platform to manage their website, then the e-commerce platform is a data controller. And as a data processor, the IT service vendor will only process personal data on specific instructions of the data controller. So that is the difference between a controller and a processor. I'll just take up a few more questions that I see. Deepak has a question. With these differences, my understanding is that companies can't afford to have a universal agreement and should push for country-specific. That's absolutely right. Universal agreement is something that most companies have, Deepak, as a DPA, but it's something that typically gets pushed back when you are signing those contracts with larger enterprises. Smaller companies who want to become your vendors may accept external or additional liability because they don't get into the depth of data protection clauses. But if you're dealing with an enterprise, it is very likely that they will negotiate to reduce the liability to whatever is relevant to that particular relation with that company. So a standard data protection agreement may not always work, but if you're a SaaS provider, you would also notice that almost all SaaS providers today have a data protection agreement template on their website. And those are fairly standardized by all contexts. And if you're an enterprise, you would negotiate to reduce the liability to only what is relevant. But if you're a startup, you don't really have a lot of options. So that's basically what's happening today globally. I'll take up another question and then just move to my slides, because once we get into the depth of it, a lot of these questions will also be answered itself. So there's a question on what is the difference between a DPO and a consent manager. So a consent manager is a keyword that you would notice in the India Digital Personal Data Protection Act. And a consent manager is basically an application or an intermediary that will manage consents for data subjects or data principals, and also be a layer between data fiduciaries and data principals. So for example, if I have given my consent to 4 different platforms and I want to revoke those consent, there are two ways that I can go about it, or a few more ways that I can go about it. I can reach out to the data fiduciary directly. I can ask them to stop processing my personal data for a specific purpose, or I can use a consent manager, which is either a web application or a mobile application, to revoke my consents for specific purpose. So consent manager is an application. A DPO is an individual who is responsible for regulatory data privacy compliance. But a consent manager is an application for data principals to send consent requests to a data fiduciary on the data principal's behalf. Right? A consent manager definition is that it's a person, but if you notice, a person is also a legal entity. If you go to one of the other sections at the top of the DPIA, it's not an actual person who is a consent manager. It's an application that manages consents for a data principal on their behalf and make sure that consent is easily managed for the data principal, and it is sent to data fiduciaries that process personal data on the basis of consent. Okay, I have another question as well from Saundarya, which is around conducting vendor due diligence. I'll just cover that in some time. Okay, so we do have a lot of questions. And CMP is a consent management platform, is also not a natural person. It's not an individual like you and me. It's an application. It's a consent management platform. Consent manager is different. A consent management platform is different. A consent management system is different. So please just go through in your free time on the differences between each of these, because it's important to understand the nuances. And appointing a consent manager is not mandatory, Akshay. Yeah. Awesome. I'll go on to the next pieces. I know that all of you have a lot of questions, but I will have to push those to a later time. You can just reach out to me on LinkedIn or maybe the Ministry of Security team, because I want to really focus on helping you understand on how to conduct a DPIA. And I don't want to digress too much from the topic, or else I know there are too many questions around data privacy that you would typically want us to answer. Right. And there was a question around TPRA, DPIA as well. So whoever asked that question, please look at this slide, maybe take a screenshot as well if it helps, because a third-party risk assessment is only focused on risks introduced by a vendor, processor, or a sub-processor. In certain cases, the risks introduced by a third-party vendor may not involve risks that are there in your internal systems or your internal processes. So there's only vendors or contract vendor governance that is scoped, and there may be certain internal systems that are not there, that are not considered as a part of a third-party risk assessment. So please make sure you understand the differences. The reason that we highlighted these is that some people use these terms interchangeably, but they don't mean the same. Right. Now, understanding risks in a DPIA, what could go wrong for the data subjects? It's all about the data subjects. It's all about the data principles. It's not about the organization. It's not about how an organization can reduce risk to itself. It's about how an organization can reduce risk to a data subject or a data principle. The rights of data subject are something that you have to really, really be careful about. In some cases, when I do a DPI, I typically put myself in the shoes of a data subject that is interacting with the company to understand whether as an individual, would I feel comfortable with the kind of processing that a company is doing and the kind of measures they have taken to make sure that processing is relevant. The four-step risk approach, a fairly standard risk approach that you identify risks, you identify data assets, you identify threats, you identify potential impacts. So when you conduct a DPIA, you can't just look at the process. You have to look at people, you have to look at process, you have to look at technology. You will have to look at APIs, you will have to look at downstream systems, integrations, plugins that you are using for that entire process. Now, if there are certain scenarios that we will also discuss, but first thing is identifying the data landscape. If you follow where the data is going, if you understand what are the different layers that data flows into, you will really understand how to create a data inventory, how to understand whether the high risk processing is triggered, and then naturally be able to conduct a data protection impact assessment. So the French Supervisory Authority, or CNIL, has three feared events that is a trigger: illegitimate access, unauthorized people having access to personal data that they shouldn't have; undesired modification, people tampering personal data, making changes to it; disappearance, ransomware, hardware failure. Right? These are some very common cybersecurity related pieces that we notice, that some attackers may just look at certain systems, maybe make sure that a ransomware is something that they introduce to that system. And in those cases, it becomes a really, really big problem. It's one of the biggest risks that we have noticed in the last few years. ransomware become really, really common. Now, the impact on data subjects, it's high if there is financial harm and identity theft. If there is reputational harm, physical safety, it's medium. There could be an impact on rights, loss of autonomy, automated exclusion. Now, what does this mean? Let's take an example of a employee or a candidate screening platform. Let's assume that you are a candidate applying for a role as a DPO in an organization. You have your CV that you uploaded to this platform, and this platform made an automated decision without a human in loop and just rejected your resume or your CV. In those cases, you have no right. It's a loss of autonomy. There's automated exclusion basis something that an AI system or a ML model has done basis the patterns it has learned from previous training. In that case, if there's no human in the loop to also look at the rejections, then it triggers conducting a DPIA to make sure that there is a human that reviews these rejected candidates and make sure that the system is not solely responsible for rejecting candidates. So it's one example of how loss of autonomy may happen. Then one of the other impacts that you see is something that's psychological, anxiety from data compromise. For example, if you're on a matrimonial platform or if you're on a dating site and your data is leaked through that dating site, that may have a lot of negative social impact for you depending on your country, depending on the cultural context. Because as an individual, you may not want people to know, you may not want your colleagues to know that you're on a dating site. And naturally, if there is a data compromise that happens for a dating platform, there is, of course, psychological impact on the data subjects as well. So these are the different kind of impacts that affect people as an individual. The 4-step risk approach, we started with identify, we look at data assets, threats, potential impacts. We draw out what are those downstream systems, what are those vendors we use, what are those third-party SaaS platforms, plugins, integrations, APIs. All of those landscape is something that we draw, understand. Then we assess. We typically look at likelihood and severity. Now, this risk matrix could be a 4x4 risk matrix or a 5x5 risk matrix and so on. But at the same time, you have to figure out what works well with your organization. You may already have an enterprise risk management framework. You may already have an information security framework, and you may want to align your data privacy risk approach to that. But you have to understand, I emphasize on this thing again, that data privacy rights, it's all about understanding the impact to rights of data subjects compared to any other risk assessment that we do, which is to understand the impact on an organization or a business. So understand this key difference, that this risk assessment is to be done to prevent negative impact on a data subject and their rights. So we identify, we assess, we treat it, we avoid it, we reduce it, we transfer it, or we accept it in certain cases where the risk is very low. And in certain cases where there is a high risk processing activity, the supervisory authority also says in EU specifically that you may need to consult with the data protection authority. But in reality, that barely happens. Even though data protection authorities are meant to respond in 8 weeks' time, you can imagine how much of an operational burden it could become on them if all organizations start asking them these questions. And then organizations or businesses don't even have the patience to wait for 2 months before they roll out a feature. In EU, of course, they do their risk assessments really thoroughly so that the risks are reduced. But in other jurisdictions, DPIA is an afterthought. Unfortunately, it is still an afterthought. So what we do is we typically recommend that DPIA should shift left. DPIA should focus on the very planning and initial understanding of what the processing activity is all about. That is when you need to conduct a data protection impact assessment. When it's looked at as an afterthought, there's already some illegal processing that may have happened. So avoid that. See that your business teams are enabled. See that they have the right kind of questionnaires that can help them understand how they are processing personal data and whether it violates any of the requirements that's there. And always score from the data subject's perspective. Don't do it from the organization's perspective. Now, these are some DPIA use cases by sector as well. So this is the first one that we spoke about. I'll go to the visual mode. Yeah. So some real world scenarios, an AI recruitment screening platform. So there's an AI agent or an AI system or a platform that looks at personal data transfer or personal data usage and automatically removes individuals or rejects individuals that don't meet a specific criteria. So this is automated execution. And as an individual in EU, you have the right to, you have a right against automated decision making as well, right? So that is where it becomes relevant. So if there's a automated decision making system that happens, then you have the right to go against the automated decision making that happens. But at the same time, data privacy being contextual, you also have to look at the local regulations that are there in the region or in the country. There may be a requirement that you may have to implement an automated solution by a particular regulator. So you have to balance the rights of a data subject, see what the regulator wants. For example, in India, a recent notification came in from the RBI, or the Reserve Bank of India, which is the banking regulatory authority, that you may have to automate certain pieces around your threat detection or cybersecurity related mandates. In those cases, you have to see how you can balance it with the rights of data subjects at the same time when you are conducting something like that. Yeah, just allow me a second. I'll just mute individuals again. I would request all of you to please mute yourself, because it sort of disturbs the flow and the discussion that we're having. And if you have questions, please drop them in the chat section. Very, very happy to take it up soon. Yeah, and most of the slides that we have, or the presentation that we have, they would probably also answer some of your questions. But if there are nuances with respect to a certain law, such as the DPIA, the EU GDPR, then might as well just push that to later, because we'll have a lot more sessions like these where we can cover those nuances, and maybe the comments that you put in, the feedback that you share, is something that we can do a session on later as well. So coming back to the different use cases that we notice, you will see that there are DPI use cases by sector. If it's patient health records, then it's special category data under the GDPR Article 35(3)(b). If it's credit scoring algorithm, it is required to conduct a DPI. If it's smart city TV plus analytics, it is specifically you have to do this, conduct a DPI. Workplace productivity monitoring, cross-border data transfer to India, government digital identity, where you are collecting biometric identification or facial data of an individual or special category of data. So those are cases where a DPIA might be triggered. Now, let's get to the live workthrough. When do you understand that a DPIA needs to be done? So we'll take a quick example. Let's assume that you are an individual that, again, shops on an e-commerce platform or a website. And when you visit the website, you notice that the company that you have visited uses something such as a Shopify for managing their e-commerce infrastructure. So if you're not aware of Shopify, it is basically a platform that allows individuals to build websites and basically have an e-commerce business out of it. And now Shopify as a business also allows a lot of integrations or a lot of third-party vendors that solve a specific purpose as well. Now, when you visit the website, there will be Shopify that you are using, which would be a processor. There would be multiple other processors as well when you make a payment. So when you make a payment, there could be a payment gateway that this company is using, something such as a PayU, JustPay, or a Razorpay that actually manages the payment. Then there could be a logistics vendor that actually delivers that good that you have ordered on the e-commerce platform to your house. There could be multiple other analytical vendors that may also be in use, because e-commerce works on a lot of relevant data analytics. They want to understand user behavior so that they can place products better. They can actually solve what the user is looking at from a UX perspective. And they may also collect data that may not be required without consent. That is very, very common, very, very usual in a country like India, or a country that does not have very stringent data protection laws. So one of the simplest things that I do to notice whether a company has robust data privacy measures is that I visit their website and notice the implementation of cookie consent. Most companies get it wrong. Most companies have a fancy UI banner that you might see on their website, but at the back end, they might collect data. There might be analytics data that goes to a company. In certain cases, it becomes a really, really big problem. So this is a simple test that I do. I visit the website, look if there's a cookie consent reference banner on the bottom left or something that's visible when you visit it for the first time. So that's a simple test that I do. Okay, I'll just take up another question. Who conducts the DPIA, DPO, or company? So Victor, to answer your question, it needs to be someone from the business team who looks at the processing activity and is responsible for it. But because We don't have much data privacy maturity across the globe today. In specifically certain countries, a DPO is expected to do it, but ideally they should not. DPIA should be done by the team that conducts the processing activity, and the DPO should be consulted, and the DPO should be signed off. So they are ideally someone who signs off on a DPIA. But if they are conducting a DPIA, there is a clear conflict of interest, because if they are doing a DPIA and a DPIA says that you cannot process personal data for this specific purpose, or you need to make some changes, then a DPO will not be able to practically advise the business to make that changes, because it would be something that a DPO has done, and it would be something that goes against the very notion of privacy on preventing harm, preventing impact to the rights of data subjects. Right. There's another question from Vaibhav, where Vaibhav says that you have a single DPI template and you have subsections such as PIA, TPRM, TIA, depending on the responses. That's a fairly ideal approach, Vaibhav. We see a lot of global organizations that follow that template, where they have a data protection master template. They have a screening questionnaire as well, right? So it's a standard approach that we specifically see in global organizations. Amar has a question, still not clear, data fiduciary and data collector. So there is no such term as a data collector. It's a data controller and a data fiduciary. Data fiduciary is the terminology that is used in India. A data controller is a terminology that is used in EU. And they essentially mean the same thing. They are the organizations that determine the means and purpose of processing personal data. So it's just different terminologies because there are different countries with different jurisdictions, but essentially the obligations are the most with a data controller and a data fiduciary. Okay. Now let's click one of these. We spoke about an individual who's visiting a website probably to buy something. And when they are buying something, maybe a shoe or a boot on an e-commerce platform, one of these processing activities will definitely help us understand how to conduct a DPI. So which one do you think is matched here for someone who visits an e-commerce platform? Does the e-commerce platform does large-scale profiling, behavioral analysis, credit scoring, marketing segmentation? What is your opinion? Yes, no. Is there special category data at scale? Data such as health, biometric, genetic, racial, political, religious data? Unlikely that this data is collected for an e-commerce purchase. Systematic public monitoring? Unlikely. Biometric identification? Unlikely. Because for an e-commerce purchase, it's very unlikely that biometric identification is done. Automated decisions with significant effects in an e-commerce? Maybe not. Processing children's data? There could be a case where children's data may also be processed. For example, if I am a child, as per the definition of a child in a specific country, and I visit a website to make a payment, then I have to be extra careful on how I process the child's data, considering that I am aware that it is a child, and you have to make reasonable steps to also verify whether a child is making that purchase or not. And that difference is something that is a very, very key nuance compared to the DPDPA and the GDPR. So it's a very, very key nuance. We'll take this off for now. Right. So this one is something that's very, very likely. There could be large scale profiling that happens. Assume that this e-commerce platform is quite famous and a lot of people shop on this particular platform. And there is, of course, a lot of analytical data that you will collect. And we notice that most companies in India do not have a cookie consent, do not have certain consent specific requirements that are taken before they process personal data. And in GDPR, it's the e-privacy directive that governs cookie consent. In India, there is no e-privacy directive equivalent. But at the same time, we know that it is a requirement under DPDPA because personal data includes direct as well as indirect identifier. So we know that DPI is mandatory. Let's go ahead and look at the second piece. Project system name, e-commerce platform, project description, platform to sell shoes to individuals present in India and EU. Purpose of processing to enable purchase and delivery of goods. Now, just give me a second. Sorry about that. Right. Now, let's assume that an individual is visiting a website and they want to purchase some good. Now, when they are purchasing this good, typically the personal data that we are processing to enable this purchase and to enable this delivery, we may not need consent for it, because this is something that the individual is visiting the e-commerce platform for. They are visiting the platform to make a purchase and delivery of good. But if the e-commerce platform is collecting other personal data attributes, creating a user profile, creating a persona of the user, making sure that targeted advertising is done, then in certain cases, you may need to collect their consent before you do that processing. So if the purpose is limited to enable purchase and delivery of goods, then of course the legal basis under GDPR could be legitimate interest or performance of contract. This is a better one. Data controller would be the e-commerce platform. Your data processors would be Shopify, which is basically the infra that you are building your e-commerce platform on. It would be your logistics vendor, the one that delivers the goods on your behalf. There would be a payment gateway that collects payment and enables the user to make a payment. And there could be multiple other vendors that you are also using to get the same thing done. You may also need a vendor that manages certain web development on your behalf. So that vendor may also receive data depending on who is building that Shopify website. So let's also add them, right? So these are some of the data processes that you would see. Ideally, we would need the legal entities, but I'm just putting in the brand name. Now let's assume that the DPO is consulted. What are the categories of personal data that we process? Name and contact details. We are also processing their financial data because we need to understand what kind of payment mode they want. Is it credit card, debit card, net banking, so on? If it's UPI, which is basically a native payment infrastructure available in India. So basis that you understand the categories of personal data. Now, who are the data subjects? It could be citizens or general public, any individual who visits your website. Third country transfers. This is very important to understand because in GDPR, we have this notion of adequacy. So there are certain countries that have an adequate data protection law, such as Singapore, Argentina, Uruguay, that are considered as adequate from a GDPR's perspective. So sharing data with these countries, you only need to have a standard contract when you do it. You may not need to have additional safeguards. But if it's a country like India and you're sharing data from EU to India, then in those cases, you have to make sure that standard contractual clauses are a part of your data transfer to India. Or if you are a global organization, you want to make sure that there is some sort of a inter-entity agreement that you sign where the entity in India is liable for a data breach if it occurs on their end. And of course, that sort of a relationship is something that you should and must determine. So assuming, I'll just give you a quick overview of what we did. The project system is called an e-commerce platform. Purpose of processing is to enable purchase and delivery of goods. Data controller would be the e-commerce platform. Your data processors could be Shopify, your logistics vendors, payment gateway, web development vendor. All of these data processors will receive different kind of personal data attributes. It is not necessary that all vendors may receive all personal data attributes, because if that happens, then you're violating one of the key data processing principles, which is purpose limitation and data minimization. So you have to collect data that is relevant for the purpose, and you have to share data with a vendor that is relevant for their processing purpose as well. So you name and contact details, financial banking data is something that you've collected. And let's assume that there is data transfer to a country without adequate safeguards. And there's also a data retention period, which could be 5 years because it's a regulatory requirement. Now let's look at the risk. So these are the different kind of risks that we have added for now, but you can always add more risks as and when the processing purpose changes or the document changes. So you can definitely use that. This is a very lightweight DPIA. DPIAs are usually in depth. There are a lot of things that companies may consider depending on their processing activities, the landscape that they operate in. But risk analysis is something that is very, very common. It's almost always done in all cases. Now, assume that discriminatory profiling decisions is done, right? And the likelihood is large. The severity of it is also large. So it is high risk. Now, let's also assume that inaccurate profiles affecting individuals, the likelihood is wrong. Severity is very high. Unauthorized access to personal data, likelihood could be long, but severity could be very high. Data loss or destruction, likelihood is long, severity is long, because you may have backups You may have different cloud service providers to also make sure that there's data backup in different regions. So this is where your business continuity, disaster recovery piece becomes really, really important. So the severity is, of course, high, or maybe to a level of between a level of 1 to 4, you could put it as 3. Now you have to understand that it is not very quantifiable. There is no very, very quantifiable way of absolutely determining the right kind of risk. It naturally is qualitative in most cases, right? I'll just see if there's a quick question that we also see. Amir, your question around if we can say that a data processing is nothing but data controller, data fiduciary is wrong. I would request that you go through the definitions and differences between a processor, fiduciary, and a controller, because they are data fiduciary and a controller are similar, but a processor is different because they are meant to follow and process data on the instructions of a fiduciary or a controller. If they do not follow those instructions and process personal data for any other purpose, they are naturally deemed as a data controller. So please requesting you to go through these terminologies because they are different. So there's a question from Mona that there is no template released by the ministry for DPDPA. Can we utilize DPI template used for GDPR for DPDPA as well? So Mona, to answer your question, yes, there is no template today. Yes, you may refer certain templates that are provided by third country or other different countries' data protection authorities, but please make sure that India-specific nuances are also captured, because you'll have to make changes to that template. India Data Protection Law or Digital Personal Data Protection Act is very consent-centric. So you may have to make changes because the legal basis in GDPR, there are different legal bases for processing data, and consent is just one of them. In DPDPA, the legal bases are primarily two: consent and certain legitimate uses. So those changes are something that you need to do. Although the data that you might capture for a DPI may be similar, but the context of it, again, will differ. So you'll have to make changes accordingly. Right now, let's assume that we did a DPI. We understood that there's one high risk, 4 medium risks, 1 low risk that we have analyzed. Now we look at the risk treatment. Right now, what is the treatment approach? We reduce, we apply mitigation measures. Owner could be the business team, for example, business team. Specific measures: don't conduct behavioral profiling only after collecting consent. Free, informed, unambiguous consent. Implementation timeline before go live. Residual risk after treatment, low. Right. Similarly, you can put in treatment types for others as well, but the high risk one is that we are focusing on because we are also right on time. So I want to give you a walkthrough of how this treatment is done. So I'll just go through this piece. If you remember, we had a visual where we spoke about the different stages. So we identified, we looked at the data assets. You can be as descriptive as possible. The more information, the better it is, the better you will be able to understand whether the different integrations, APIs, systems that it flows through are something that we need to understand. Now, as brief as possible, as many systems as you can describe is the best way to conduct a DPI. How we do it is we make sure that we have a questionnaire that looks at all IT systems. We also look at all AI related systems as well, right? Because now there are certain agents that may also make a request to APIs. So keeping that in mind, please be aware that there are innovative technologies that have been introduced. Be very careful, be very particular about how they are used in your business ecosystem. Right? So the 4 steps that we discussed was identify, assess, treat, and monitor. So we are on treat right now, where we are trying to reduce the risk that is posed by behavioral targeting without consent. So we are taking consent now, we are taking it in a form that is free, informed. We are making sure that a consent notice is provided. We are explaining the data principal or subject, how we are processing their data, why we are doing it, the processors that we share data with. So once you share that information, collect consent, then you may do that monitoring. Right? And what is the review frequency? Could be biannual, annual, next scheduled review date based on the date that you've chosen, maybe 26th, a date before. DPI owner, head of your business. DPO sign off status, let's say it has sign off and the DPO opinion is also documented. So once you do this, you can generate a DPIA summary, and then you can probably look at this piece that we have here as a DPIA summary as well. Now, you have to understand that this presentation is an HTML file. It will work fantastically on any browser, any ecosystem that you have. We will share this with you after the call as well. But if there is some piece that doesn't work for you, it may be because you're using it on a work system. But if you use it on a personal system, it won't be a challenge, and you will be able to generate a summary. But you have to understand that this is not legal advice. This is not something that you can use to test the waters with regulators as well, because this is just a lightweight DPI in helping you understand the depth of what you should be looking out for. Identify, analyze, assess, treat, and then monitor. So this has to be a frequent activity. This has to be periodic activity. You must make sure that you do it on a periodic basis. And now with the compliance timeline for the Indian Digital Person Data Protection Act also ticking, we note that the deadline for compliance is 13 May 2027. Some companies are feeling that this, of course, is a lot of time. 18-month compliance window is sufficient. But believe me, in an enterprise, it takes more than 3 months to even align stakeholders to have a discussion. Right? 3 months to at least align stakeholders to have a discussion, 4 more months to conduct discussions, 3 more months to understand the context, create that inventory. And within that 9-month period, there is a possibility that your company may introduce a new product, a new feature, or a new initiative. So you also have to keep a track of that. So if today your companies or enterprises have not started this journey, my recommendation would be to start it as soon as possible, probably get them on board to at least have this discussion around data privacy, understand how it applies, understand where it applies, and then of course go about it. So this is what we wanted to cover for today's session. We had a very short time. We only had a 1-hour window where there were a lot of things that we wanted to talk about, but our focus was more on the nuances that you have to analyze, understand, evaluate while you conduct a data protection impact assessment. I know that some of you may have a lot of questions that may have been unanswered, but feel free to reach out to either the MOS team or me on LinkedIn. I'll try to answer as many as possible with the relevant case laws, with the relevant nuances that are there. And Hitesh asked if there is a tool for conducting DPIA. There are privacy automation platforms, yes. OneTrust is very famous. TrustArc, Security.ai are global platforms that you can use to conduct a DPIA or create a workflow automation. But there are also open source available DPIA tools, such as the CNIL platform, the French Supervisory Authority platform. So you can simply Google CNIL DPIA tool, and you will find an open source version of it that you can also use. Right. I hope that answers most of the questions. And if there are a few more that you want to ask, feel free to reach out. We are very, very happy to help you out on that. Kushi, I would just pass it over to you if you want to share some parting words with the participants.
Sure. So thank you so much, Krishna. Thank you for taking such an insightful session. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thanks for making this a great success. So I would request all the participants to have, whatever the questions they would have, they can just feel free to reach out to Krishna, or directly feel free to reach out to MOS. We would be happy to help you. And we are also planning CIPM training in the month of April with Krishna. So anyone who is interested to be a part of it, they can directly reach out to us. So we will be sharing the details soon. So thank you everybody. Thanks Krishna again for such an insightful session. Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for staying till the end. Love that when that happens in a session. It means you enjoyed it, and looking forward to more discussions with all of you. Thanks. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.